Welcome to Talk to the Left. I'm your host, Jason Rigden. On this episode of the show, I'm here with Colin from the Seattle Sucks podcast. How are you today?
I'm just fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. So could you give me a brief description of the Seattle Sucks podcast?
Yeah, well, we like to say it's a podcast about hating the city that we love. And I know that's a little bit abstract, perhaps, but it encapsulates sort of everything we're trying to do. So we're mostly 3 or 4 guys trying to take a look at Seattle events and Seattle political happenings with a leftist perspective, and also occasionally with a satirical lens at some of the cultural things in this city.
Yeah, Seattle is a very hard city to love. It always feels like it's pushing you away.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So could you give the audience maybe an example? Like, what did you cover in your last episode?
Yeah. So, well, this is maybe a little bit abnormal, but since we're coming into the midterms, we went over the Stranger Editorial Control Board, I believe is what they call themselves, their endorsements for the midterms, and basically just tried to look skeptically at the coverage of some of the candidates and ask them to do more from a truly progressive perspective.
Yeah, I feel like the Stranger sometimes has the attitude of being very progressive, but when you really get into the details, oftentimes it's lacking.
Yeah, and I, unfortunately, that in doing this show, I think that is something that has really solidified for all of us, that we all in Seattle believe that we are crazy leftists, but really we're kind of center left at best.
And so how long have you been doing the show?
So I think we started I think it was May of this year, so 2018. And I don't know if you're familiar with the quote. I can't remember if it comes from the Manchester music scene or Velvet Underground, but we went to go see Chapo live when they came through. And some of our other friends have started podcasts. So it's sort of like everyone at that show went on to start a leftist podcast. That's what we like to joke.
And did you do any podcasts before this one?
Well, so Greg and I hadn't, but our friend and the host, Alex, he did a history podcast with some of his friends, which was called Confluence of Events. And I think you can still find some of the episodes out there. And it's actually pretty good. I enjoyed it a lot.
And how long have you all been in the Seattle area?
I think maybe all of us have sort of come and gone, but most our whole lives. So I went to school in Texas, so I was gone for about 4 years, but otherwise have lived in Seattle my whole life, so over 30 years. And I think Alex maybe lived in New York for a bit and Alaska, but pretty much has lived in Seattle his whole life. And Greg was, as he's talked about at length on the show, lived in LA for a bit, but otherwise has lived in Seattle his whole life.
Yeah, I think one of the unique things about Seattle is that it seems like almost everybody here is from somewhere else. And even if they aren't, then they spend a lot of time traveling.
Definitely. Yeah, we've become a transplant city.
Yeah, I think that's a source of a lot of our problems. I don't think a lot of people are really invested in the city.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we've probably belabored this on the show, but it really makes it a little bit difficult to have any kind of cohesive cultural movement, if that makes sense, because there's very few people that grew up here and have any vestiges of whatever existed before. So
yeah, why increase taxes when I'm only going to be here for another 2 years?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what do you hope to do with the show? Like, what motivates you?
For me personally, I can't speak for everybody else, but I would imagine they would say something similar, is that we really, after the 2016 election, which if you consider yourself even center left, a Democrat, was very demoralizing. We all kind of had this epiphany, I guess, about our politics. And so I think our goal is to really try to push the conversation as far to the left as we can and to really question some of the thinking of neoliberals, and which really means Democrats. And also, I think it's been a goal of ours to be a platform for underrepresented voices in this city specifically. I know that's a goal of ours, especially because of what we just talked about with so many transplants, so much gentrification, so much really flight from Seattle from people that can't afford to live here any longer. So.
Yeah, and you do it in a very inclusive way. One thing that I find kind of frustrating about the left in general is oftentimes there's quite a bit of elitism and it's hard to feel accepted or welcome. Whereas in your show, you just kind of, I feel like, embrace people.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to hear that, but I couldn't agree with that more. I think you see that a lot in all kinds of things, but for some reason, the left is pretty tribal for sure. So hopefully that's something we can change.
Do you think that Seattle is becoming a more conservative city?
I do, yeah. And I think that is probably true really of the country at large, but it's almost more acute here because there isn't really any strong opposition. I mean, we're kind of a one-party town, really. So it's been frustrating to see that, definitely.
Yeah, one thing I always wonder is why don't more of the conservative Democrats run as liberal Republicans? I mean, that area seems like that would be a good strategy.
Yeah. I think I think you're right, but it's been such a poison pill, which kind of underscores that the absurdity of Seattle thinking it's so progressive. We talked about this in our last show, but the King County prosecutor position this year was between Dan Satterberg and Darren Morris, and Darren Morris ran a very progressive leftist campaign. He was a public defender before this, and so he pulled a Republican left. And so Dan Satterberg, who had been a Republican, I think, up until this year, once they started campaigning, turned into a Democrat because I think he could sense that trouble. So yeah, Republican is it's kind of
like they don't want to
bad
feel like
word
the
in
Republicans,
Seattle,
but oftentimes
sure.
they act like Republicans.
Yeah, and I think, and we talked about this on the show too. I think that's because there's been such a vacuum of ideology from Democrats, especially a progressive ideology. That means that this centrism, the tendency to search for bipartisan solutions and being pragmatic, has just meant that our politics have moved to the right and are continuing to move to the right. And if we're not paying attention, then we're just going to go right with that tide out to sea. So we really have to struggle against that impulse, I think.
So what have been some of the biggest challenges of doing this show?
I would say scheduling. Maybe that's probably a podcast.
It's a perennial issue. Yeah.
A common podcast. Yeah, exactly. But scheduling has definitely been a problem for us. For a while, we had so much more to talk about than we possibly could. I would say things have cooled down a little bit. So being so focused on current events, especially through that political lens, has at times made it hard to find big stories that we'd like to talk about. But so far, I think we've done okay. But those have been challenges.
And how do you prepare for your episodes?
Well, how deeply would you like me to answer this?
However deeply you feel comfortable. Do you have like a Google Doc, or do you just go into it?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So we use Slack. We started out using email for ideas for the first couple of shows, but then we moved to Slack. So we will create a channel for every episode, and then throughout the week, or however much time it takes for us to deliver the episode, we will all kind of share articles or tweets or things that we found that we think that we could potentially talk about on the show. And then in the days before, or potentially hours or minutes before the show, we go through those links, and then we use a Google Doc and kind of do an outline and go from there.
And so how do you keep up with Seattle news? Do you have any favorite sources?
For me, I'm on Twitter a lot. As I've talked about on the show, I'm a stay-at-home dad, so I don't exactly have downtime, but I certainly have time when I can be on my phone. So I see things from left Twitter, so Seattle DSA. I see things from Day, from Nikita Oliver, Carrie Moon, people who are kind of talking about what's going on in the city. And then we will troll the Seattle Times. We will sometimes troll the Stranger, just looking for stories. And then because we've wrapped Jeff Bezos into our beat, we kind of occasionally look at national platforms if they're covering Amazon or Jeff Bezos specifically.
So one thing that I noticed with Seattle media is that the city's kind of bursting at the seams with bullshit.
Yeah.
And sometimes I find myself like kind of caught in it. Is there any way that you keep your head clear?
Yeah. I feel like this is just a symptom that is sort of true at the micro and the macro level. And I know for me personally, I try not to engage too much. I'm sort of more passive, so I might get frustrated in the moment, but usually just because of our process, we don't often boil over or get too wrapped up in something petty or, like you said, bullshit.
And do you have any plans for the future of the show?
Well, one thing that we have wanted to do for a long time and have only successfully done once is have more guests. We would really like to have more guests, and we definitely like to have guests from sort of all walks of Seattle life, not just people who are political, whether that be journalists or organizers, but potentially artists or anyone that feels alienated in Seattle or just kind of wants to maybe dunk on Jenny Durkin for a bit. So that's definitely one big focus of ours in the future. And I know that Greg would really like to just maybe potentially even broaden the show a bit and try to find some maybe more regular guests that we could have to just add more viewpoints and diversify some of the thought.
And kind of build sort of a community around the show.
Yeah. Okay. That's certainly been a challenge for us. I wouldn't say we're particularly good at it. So hopefully slow and steady will win the race.
So do you have any plans to try to monetize it, or are you doing that now? Do you do any ads or Patreon?
We do not do ads, and I'm personally against advertising. I imagine the rest of my hosts would be as well. So there are no plans to do ads. We do have a Patreon, but I have to say from what I've seen in the podcasting community, mostly thanks to the good work that you've done with your Seattle podcast list, is that it maybe is kind of hard to make too much money on Patreon at the hyper local level, which is certainly where we're functioning. So, serious monetization, no plans. If you in the software world, if you'd like to buy us coffee, like we have a Patreon, you can donate some money, but no big push beyond that right now.
Yes, I know the woes of not having any ads. I mean, I am probably in the same boat as you. I'm just not feeling comfortable selling these internet mattresses or whatever. But then you wish you could get some kind of compensation for your time or something, some kind of validation.
Totally. Yeah. Because it's a lot of work and, it's a lot of work and I guess it's sort of, for us anyway, it's a little bit opaque as to who's on the other side of the mic. And so that's just one way to get some, I guess, validation that you're doing good, but that might speak more to my own insecurities as a person than anything else. I don't know.
So what are some of the ways that we could help the show?
I don't know. I mean, you are one of our fans. So what you've done has been, as far as I'm concerned, has been awesome. People that follow us on Twitter like you and sort of amplify our message or have conversations with us is certainly helpful. And maybe honestly, just if you like the show, sort of evangelize it. talk to other people about the show, try to get them into the show, or even if you hear some resistance, just talk to us however you want to talk to us, whether that be on Twitter or on via email or any other medium that you can use to find us. Let us know what we're doing wrong or what we could do better. And we'll definitely listen. So
on that note of helping, how do you suggest that people help the city be better?
Yeah. So it's just so difficult. I guess it feels like the only thing that we can do, the only thing that has been successful in recent history is to fight pretty hard and to protest and to like with the employee head tax to take, I think it was 2 or 3 years to build a movement to make truly progressive change happen. And I know that is not it's not a very energizing thing to say, but and we've said this on the show, I think as true leftist progressives that we have a much harder road in a city like Seattle than conservatives do, because the center left loves to call everything that we want to do crazy, for lack of a better word. So, I mean, we just have to keep showing up and keep fighting for the things we believe in.
I think tying those last two questions together is that people to help can really help share these alternative media sources. I mean, we're kind of in a I don't want to say a renaissance. I don't know what you'd call it, like a blossoming of left-wing podcasts. And when you look at the effect of right-wing AM radio, like in the 90s and the long-term effects, like if we nurture this here now on the left, maybe it will help us a decade from now.
Yeah. I think that is the perfect analogy because I think that this is the left's moment, as it was for Newt Gingrich and the modern Republican Party as we know it in the 90s to really fight back and gain some ground. And as you said, I mean, in this city especially, it's kind of hard to get a leftist message out into, I mean, you're not going to see it in the Seattle Times, but the more podcasts that show up, the more zines or even Twitter accounts that show up, the better likelihood that eventually something is going to percolate up to those sources.
Yeah, and we have to do it because we want to do it, not because we're getting the money. Because
totally, yeah.
No one's giving us money. We're desperately trying, but no one will give us money.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that reminds me, there's Quincy Jones had a quote about songwriting that was like, the minute you start thinking about money is the minute God walks out of the room. And I think that's kind of true of anything, that if your heart isn't in it for the right reason, then it's just going to be harder, if not impossible.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. It's like a little gremlin that's on your shoulder, kind of, at least for me, whispering, you know.
Yeah. I totally understand. I think that's human nature. And that's just a temptation we have to resist.
So then what are some of your favorite podcasts out there?
You know, I really loved your first episode, and I'm excited for this show and what it will become. And I have to say, I'm really happy. I'm both elated and bummed that I'm the second call on the show. But your show's fantastic. We're big fans of Chapo Trap House, which is more of the national level political thought. Those are, that's the sort of the big one, I think, for us and me.
And so even though your show's called Seattle Sucks, what's your favorite thing about the city?
I think my favorite thing about Seattle, which is probably a little bit cliche, is just the natural beauty that we're surrounded by. The sound, the Olympics, the Cascades, Mount Rainier, that even though we're with all this Amazon boom, we're still kind of surrounded by some incredible natural beauty that you don't see that in many other cities. and I think it's very unique. And a sunset over the Olympics is one of my favorite things in the world. So yeah.
Well, I really, really love your show. Is there anything that I should have asked you that maybe I missed?
No, I don't think so. And thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I have all the links in the show notes.
Thank you for having me.
Talk to the Left is 100% independent. I'm just some dude in Seattle with a microphone and way too much spare time. I need your help to reach new listeners. You are probably listening to this on some kind of podcasting app. Almost all those apps have a way to share a podcast episode on social media. If you think that this episode was important and that more people should hear it, then could you share this episode on Facebook or Twitter? Or maybe you are even listening to this episode on Facebook or Twitter. In that case, sharing this episode is even easier. In this age of algorithmically controlled ads, word of mouth is more important than ever, even if that word of mouth is digital. So please share this episode on social media. Change won't happen without action, and every action counts, no matter how small.